Welcome to the Bash Shell Scripting Guide. In this lesson, we will introduce you the shell and explain the purpose of shell. We will also look at different other types of shell and what is their use. So first, the definition of shell. A shell is a command line utilities which interacts with the kernel on user's behalf. It interprets the message which users enters from the console or terminal. So it's basically kind of a interpreter because a kernel can understand a message in certain format. Kernel has a well-defined interface to interact with it due to security. For example, a kernel cannot understand most of the stuff except for the calls through system call. So which means a user which wants to interact with the kernel has to write a system call, which is not possible all the time. So what a shell does is take the input from the user, massage the input, make it in such a way that the kernel can understand and call the necessary system call on behalf of the user and get the message back from the kernel and present it to the user. So shell is nothing but a command line interpreter. There are different types of shell and we will look into mostly bash shell because it's the most predominantly used one. There are other type of shell like C shell, Corn shell, TCSH, ASH. We will go through each of them. So on the broader way, there are two categories in which all the shell lies. One is C shell categories and one is the Bourne shell. C shell categories, the shell which lies are C shell itself and the TCSH. The name C shell has been given because when it was written in such a way that it understands some of the C type syntax. C type, not exactly, it's not a C language, but C type syntax. Bourne shell is a native shell which was written first, and then there was an extension to that which is a bash, and then there are other shell like Corn shell and PDSH which are kind of similar but not same. In this lecture and video, in the entire video series, we will be learning only bash shell. Most of the things which you learn will be applicable to Corn, PDSH, Bourne, all kinds of cells. They are almost similar, but there are still some differences. But C shell is very different. So whatever you learn will not be applicable to C shell, but for all other cells, it would be almost similar, and probably you can say 80 to 85% of the things matches between all these shells. So what is there are other things which shell can do. For example, shell can interpret the input and present it in a way so that kernel can understand. So what I mean by this statement is like this. So for this exercise, for this entire tutorial, we will be using Ubuntu and I will be doing hands-on on Ubuntu. I'm using Ubuntu as my virtual machine. This is my Ubuntu machine and we will learn everything practical on Ubuntu. It will be same for CentOS or maybe Mint or Kali Linux, whatever you want to use. But Ubuntu is amongst the best in terms of desktop applications, ease of use, so we will go for Ubuntu. So let me tell you what I meant exactly by it interprets users commands. So there is one command called echo, and echo means whatever you write it will just echo back onto the screen. Simple, something like printf in any other language, printf or println. So I said echo hello world and it just printed hello world. It's just echo. Now if I say echo star, let's see what it gives. You see, when I say echo star, it says desktop. It's not giving me star because there is one folder called desktop here in my present working directory, and that's what it is showing. Now let's suppose if I go to some other directory and I say echo star, what it gives. It lists out all the files and folders present in this directory. Something, if you are familiar with ls, something what ls command does. So it seems like echo star is interpreting what is a star. Now let's suppose if I just want to echo itself, I can have it as a string literal, and then it will echo just the star. There is a difference between double quote and single quote. We will learn through all of these. So now here also the double quotes it will say star, but still there is a difference between these and this in terms of variable expansions. We will go through all of this in some of the later chapters, but what I wanted to show you is about the interpretation. So what is happening exactly is when you say star, star is treated as a wildcard. So wildcard means it will try to grab all the files and folders in the particular folder where you have executed the command, and it tries to see, okay, what are all the things present in that folder. That's the way it does the command substitution, and that's why it is giving. If you just say star, it's a, but if you say echo j some character, it will say j because j doesn't falls under some kind of wildcard. That is exactly what I meant by interpretation. So whatever you type may not be exactly whatever it is presented to the kernel. There is something else which is presented to the kernel. So this shell scripting would be applicable to almost all kind of POSIX compliant OS. By POSIX I mean to say like Mac OS X. If you're using the terminal of Mac OS X, you can use bash shell scripting. You can use in FreeBSD, and of course on Linux. In Linux you can do it in different kinds of flavors like Ubuntu, CentOS, Fedora, Mint, Kali Linux, and whatnot. Whatever flavor, almost all of them has the bash shell. And in Windows 10 nowadays they're coming in with bash shell as well, so you can use Windows 10 also to do some of the exercise, although I cannot comment exactly how complete they are, but you can give it a try. Now what is the shell which you will be using? Now since there are C shell, bash shell, ASH, conch shell, so how do a user know which shell he will be using? That is something which is being set by the administrator when he creates your user account. So when a user account is being created, that account entry goes into a file called etc password, and in that etc password there is a last field. This field signifies what kind of shell you want to use. If instead of bin bash, if I would have said slash bin slash ash, it should have taken ash shell, or maybe sh, which is bourne shell. Bash is born again shell, and the first shell was sh, which is bourne shell. So this way we can change the shell entry. There are other fields which I will explain in details in some other lectures as and when we come across all these things, but this is just a starting and I would like to give you some introduction for this shell. The other easy way is finding out your shell is you go to your terminal and say echo $shell. We will go through the meaning of dollar and how to do variable expansion, what is a variable, everything. So if you say echo $shell, it will tell you the kind of shell it is. Let's suppose if you were in ASH shell or SH, it would have given you something like bin SH or bin KSH for K shell. Now, how does the shell looks like in terms of hardware and kernel? So this is the way it is. So hardware is at the very bottom, and then on top of hardware we have a kernel which controls the hardware and resources. The kernel has entry points. If you want to enter into the kernel, talk to the kernel, you have to go through system calls. System calls are absolutely must to interact with the kernel. A kernel cannot understand anything and absolutely anything except for system call. At least this is the way Linux works. And then shell interacts with the kernel using system call. So remember I said like, okay, it's an interpreter. So let's suppose take an example for echo star. So what does the shell does? Shell does says, okay, I want to expand all the names with respect to the files present in the current directory. So what echo might be doing in that terms is take the current directory and recursively tries to find out how many files are present. The way to find out all the files which are present in a particular directory, it must be doing dir entry kind of system call to the Linux kernel, getting all the response back to the shell, and then showing you all the files and folders one at a time. And then of course you can have your own custom applications which can talk to the system call and in terms interact with the kernel and probably can interact with the hardware. And this is the user, you sitting on top of that running applications using system calls, contacting kernel, and same way user using shell script and running. So this is the way shell script works. Now shell script is just an interpreter, so let us also go through what is the kernel. Kernel is the heart of operating system. In case of Ubuntu, Fedora and this kind of OS, it manages the resources like CPU, memory, disk. For Windows also it does the same, but the kernel functionality like in terms of device driver, file system, the way everything is a file in Linux is not the same in Windows. So we will not go into those kind of details, but just an introduction. So kernel is something which manages all your hardware, manages all your hardware resources. And when we say resources, the resources are mostly like CPU, memory, disk, and IO. Now in contrast, shell just interacts with the kernel and give the work to the kernel, and it is the kernel which does all the work and gives the output back. So if you look at the diagram, how does the shell and different kinds of utilities in the system looks like, it would be like this. So hardware is at the very core of the kernel, means it's not a part of a kernel, but in this diagram it is at the very core, at the heart. On top of that is a kernel. Kernel protects the hardware, which means kernel is the one which will be using the hardware. It will not allow a user applications to interact with the hardware directly. And on top of that there are different kinds of applications or utilities, or maybe there is a shell. Here it is sh, which is a bourne shell. It could have been bash shell. And then there can be other applications which can be directly contacting to the kernel through system call, or these applications might interact through the bash shell and in turns goes to the kernel. When I say directly, right now it is possible, but the way typical applications run, all the applications you open a terminal and run in a terminal. Now when you open a terminal, it's a bash shell. So that's why these other applications goes to the shell only. It cannot go directly, but it is even though possible that without any terminal you can run it, but it might not be that interesting. We will learn all these concepts in the upcoming videos, and I will also tell you what all the different kinds of commands, utilities, and the scripting we will be doing in my next video. Thank you for watching.